Good morning and welcome to the Pavilion End podcast. Today we have a conversation with Akshobh Giridharadas, former sports journalist based in Singapore, now based in Washington, working in geopolitics. And we're going to talk about a few things. I should mention that we're exactly 12 hours apart, which is very tidy. 7:30 in the morning here. I've postponed breakfast, the most important meal of the day, for this conversation. Akshob's in Washington, perhaps postponing dinner. Anyway, we're going to talk about a few things. Of course, there's the imminent World Test Championship final starting in London at Lord's on Wednesday. I will be there. Well, at least I very much hope so. I'm flying up to London tomorrow. We'll talk about the pangs, that's the word, that's Akshob's own word, the pangs of being a South African supporter. I say his own choice of words in a recent piece on Substack. And we'll have some thoughts about the future of Test cricket. But first, the World Test Championship final. Of course, it's Australia and South Africa. Akshobh, you'd think that Australia must be firm favourites to win this match. Would you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. One is for three reasons. One is because Australia. Two is a run of form, and three, it's a final that involves South Africa. So, who would ever give South African good odds for that? Because it's not just South Africa playing against Australia; it's South Africa playing against itself and playing against the baggage of being in finals and its own hoodoo of getting classic case yet so close and yet so far, which is the pangs, as you described the word. Of being a South African fan.
We'll talk a lot more about South Africa later, though I must say you mentioned their form in finals, but have they actually been in many finals? They've been in lots of semi-finals, which of course makes it even worse. But, so they have at least, they have at least got to the final in this tournament, although their path to the final, of course, has been the cause of some, not controversy, but some. Well, it's the competition is rather flawed for obvious reasons. And the most obvious one, perhaps, being that two of the main countries can't even play each other. But South Africa, I think I'm right in saying that in this cycle of games, they haven't played Australia at all until now. They did play India in South Africa, and I think they drew the series. They certainly won. They beat India once, but then I think lost to them also. And they didn't play England in this cycle either. And to be fair to England, I think they could be said to be one of the stronger test sides. But that's not South Africa's fault. They're given a schedule. They have to play that schedule, and they won most of the games they played, which is why they're in the final. So one can't question their authority to be playing in this match. But they haven't played Australia yet in this cycle. And one would think, as you say, the run of form, Australia have got so many top players still, and one would think that they ought to win this game, and they might win it in something fewer than 5 days, depending on the weather.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. One is, you're right. I mean, look, this will probably tie in well to your later question on where we see Test cricket going, because in some ways, it's not, while it's a World Test Championship, it's sort of the T20ification of cricket, right? You're finding new ways to innovate the sport you and I love, and trying to, sort of try and inject. The whole concept of a Test cricket it's based on 5 days over a series of 3, 4, maybe 5. It's sort of like, for the more football aficionado, like a league. Because the Premier League, like a test, is not based on one-off finals, right? It's based on a longer form where consistency is tested, or as Ian Chappell would say, it's test cricket because it's a test, right? So the whole idea of having a one-off final in a neutral venue is kind of very antithetical to the whole concept of what a test is over 5 days over a league. The Test cricket is a very beautiful metaphor for life, which I'll get to later on when you ask me the question of Test cricket. Yeah. But just on the South Africa part, you're right, they haven't won too many finals, but I suppose the heartbreaks are so excruciating that it does feel like a final, because the capitulation has been very redolent of what a team experiences when it's so close so apart. And of course, lest we forget the famous or infamous Barbados with T20 thing, where it was euphoric for Indian fans, and you sort of one explained to a lot of Indian fans, Indian still support South Africa, whereas it's sort of a very South African to clutch defeat from the jaws of victory, and and I think because the reason why in the South African fan in me, why it all seemed like a finalist, not only the way South Africa ends up being harakiri, but it's almost like had they got over this hurdle, they're gone over to win whatever tournament. And we think of 99 inch Faston or and 96, the World's World Cup, and so many other things, or their semi-final demarcus in New Zealand. A few of those.
Oh yes.
Get over the final and they just get over. They did cross it, but anyways, that's the temptation with a South African fan, and just the World Test Championship again. It's the hope that kills you, right? And it's sort of what we all hope for. It's the optimism of the will and the pessimism of the intellect, and I think that's what I've always learned as a sports fan, and it's particularly a South African cricket fan.
Yes, of course, South Africa's record in ICC tournaments, as you say, has been almost tragic, and we'll wonder if this will be adding to the list. But what I think is a shame is that 10 years ago, say, South Africa probably did have the best Test team in the world. They had some genuinely all-time great players, A.B. de Villiers, Jacques Kallis, Dale Steyn, then the supporting cast, if we can call it supporting cast, people like Graham Smith, Hashim Amla, Morny Morkel, even the players who were not real stars I used to like. I used to love watching J.P. Duminy. Thought he was a wonderful player to watch. And it's a shame, this side, of course they've got some outstanding cricketers. Rabada is probably their... Would it be fair to say he's their one world-class player at the moment? I think Marco Jansen might become a world-class player, but Rabada probably... Is Rabada actually playing?
Yeah, Rabada, no doubt, is one of the is right up there. I remember in the 2014, when he was sort of in the under-19s, really coming through, and then in the 2015 World Cup, just was one of the players to look out for. Yeah. And then let's not forget the 2018 series, the Sankit again. But it seems fits a number, and it takes something for a bowler that young. I think he really crossed over into the 200 wickets pretty fast. And let's not forget, the very important thing about Tegis Rabada, he's part of the South Africa born-free generation, right? So he's one of the, we know about Makani Tini, South Africa's first cricketer. Right. Yeah. But Makani Tini also carried within the pangs of being, on the outside for a lot of his younger life growing up. And Tegis Rabada doesn't have any of the same angst the same way Makani Tini would have had. He sort of has come into his own. And I think this is sort of what is very relevant if anyone understands South African sports is the Invictus generation. When in the France of Pinas 1995, there's only one black player that time, Chester. Whereas now, even though the Springboks is still seen more as the Afrikaner sport, but it's still more part of the rainbow nation than Madiba envisioned, like a multicultural thing. And I think South African cricket in some ways have tried to do that. But I think we can talk more about the coal bag status and about how the quota system has sort of been the downfall of South African cricket to an extent. And sort of England's win. Because if you think about at one point, the 2005 Ashes series or something, where you have people like Andrew Strauss, Kevin Peterson, and...
Yes, yeah, indeed. No, that's absolutely right. And then, of course, Jofra Archer a bit later, and... Yes, Australia, you'd think that this great Australian side, it ought to be reaching a transitional stage, but they're still producing the goods. Those three fast bowlers, I assume they're all going to be playing. It's amazing how they have kept going for so long. And then with Smith, of course, having had a little bit of a dip when he tried for some reason to open the batting, now seems to be back on form, got hundreds against India and Sri Lanka. We saw it. I was there in Gaul for his second 100 in that series. They just look pretty well unstoppable, I think, it's fair to say. The opening position may be a little unclear, but in general. Also, I think Cameron Green has been playing county cricket, but he hasn't been bowling. So I'm not sure what that does about the balance of the side.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to that series one where India came down, and I think there was a sense of optimism when India came down, even though, well, actually, perhaps not so much optimism in the beginning, because India just on the back of a hammering. So, the New Zealand
Yes, right.
happens once every ever,
Yeah.
So, and then all of a sudden in Perth, it was, place for Australia. Just it's imperial sport. Well, it wasn't a whacker. It still got, the reincarnation of the whacker in a fast healing track. And in some ways, when India won at Perth, it almost Gab-esque, not as euphoric as the Gabba win of 2021, because that was, David v. Goliath at the Gabbatoir, and now just the Gabba. And the fact that at Perth, it was not just Yashasvi Jaiswal Paddy, but it was just the Bumrah song. And people spoke of Australia. Oh my goodness me, some serious flaws. Plus Shane, who, a few years ago had a bat like Steve Smith, like anything he touched turned to gold, like the Midas touch. And all of a sudden, they were like, Virat Kohli picking from Bumrah's, but everyone's number, be it Usman Khawaja or Lucas Shane or Steve Smith. And, it was all about the vulnerability in the Australian thing. How we're going to taper you those cracks. But it just turned out that, Australia would eventually go Australia and come strong. And India just capitulated because they didn't really have good answers in what they did in 2018. And what I felt was also very relevant to Australian cricket is, let's just say Steve Smith, the once every generation we've seen from from Alan Border, then you have Steve Waugh, Ricky Ponting, and then Steve Smith. They're not being forms, the perfect Australian. Just Steve Smith is a different sort of surgeon. He wasn't the in your face surgeon. One would argue after sandpaper gate, he knew how to cross, the Australian thresholds that that Australian cricketers do have the sense of Larrick in touch about themselves. But with Steve Smith, when he average he goes to 60, people said he was the greatest since Bradman, and believes he a lot more cricketers. And I remember when he was playing in the Ashes, I remember, and the tube station you're very familiar with in St. John's Wood, one of the commentators, the announcer, announced that this is where you get off for Lord Six, and if anyone has any idea how to get Steve Smith out, please let us know. And no one had an answer for it, and Steve Smith seemed the most complete. And I think the closest that I saw Steve Smith struggle was that series in 2021 when Ravi Shastri decided, all right, you know what? If you can't score runs, let's just make sure that we take off the offside and make sure that he shuffles across and gives wickets. It worked for a bit. He scored 1 century, which was subpar from Steve Smith standards. But you're right, they're very strong. And even though someone like Usman Khawaja, people spoke about but he came through in Shiznika, Shane, people said his time is up. And the Australians did have a problem in one way, Bill, because one hand, let's talk about the bowling for a second. This was the one finest attacks we've seen since the likes of McGrath and Vaughan and Speed and that kind of this some content. When you look at someone like Cummins, he's a renaissance. I mean, that guy is any guy that you're watching it a team. Sharabay, affable, fast bowling, aggression without the aggression in your face, aggression that quintessential fast bowlers have. You would have thought Australia, land but you're not really produced great fitness in Shane Warne. You'd have a guy like, Nathan Lyon come across and get the 500 number up, and Mitchell Stark has been old Warhorse very strong, and Josh Hazelwood. And if not Hazelwood, Scotty Bolden comes in and he just, takes the mat with him that he's already bowling at 3 all over again. So the bowling has been by far one of the best, and I think that's not a problem Australia going to have, because if you think about it, that Tamil Lay's debut at 18, Stark also 19, and, all these guys still young. And for a fast bowler, the longevity is how young this.
Yeah,
because for a long time, you don't have that coming through. So that's another problem Australia going to have. This. And that, you're right. I mean, I think, Steve Smith and Labuschagne and Usman Khawaja could be a song, but of course, they're all saving themselves for the Ashes, are they not?
Well, that's absolutely true. I think, Pat Cummins is going to be regarded as one of the great cricketers, I think. I think his record is very remarkable. He was lucky in a sense. Of course, he started very young, but was then injured and missed, I think, about 3 years. And I think that has actually added to his longevity. But I think he's got great presence as a captain, and as a batsman, he's often done. He's a real thinking cricketer. I always think, I know it's nothing to do with Test cricket, but you remember that extraordinary innings in the World Cup a couple of years ago, the Glenn Maxwell's innings against Afghanistan.
Yes. Oh, don't remind me. That was the drop catch. I mean, if anything,
well, yes.
I hope the Afghan team called Osha gives up on us. is there a way of recovering from this? Because Afghanistan had beaten England, beaten Pakistan, and I joked with Afghan friends. A lot of them here in Washington since 2021. One is after Afghanistan beat England, the quip, I said it was a graveyard of cricket empires. And I said they're only beating England and Pakistan. If only they could beat the US and Russia, they would arrange their geopolitical wars.
Right, yes.
It's a sport in some ways.
Well,
right?
indeed, yeah.
That's what's beautiful about sport. It's the asymmetry of what a country's wealth is and the global stature. And then if you think about it on the field, it's 11v11. And as much as I would never quote a FIFA president, but when he was asked by Iraq who was playing the World Cup, he said, it's not about countries or regimes, it's about teams, 11 players, 11 players.
Right.
You know? So I think that's the beauty about it, right? And, you know?
The only reason I mentioned that really is I thought Cummins' part in that victory was very remarkable. He, they lost a lot of wickets, if you remember, when Maxwell came. And if Cummins hadn't stayed with Maxwell, Australia wouldn't have won that game. And I thought he played incredibly sensibly in that game. Anyway, there we are, the World Test Championship final. Hopefully it will be a cracker of a game. I hope particularly for Tembo Bavuma that South Africa put up a real show. I think this is a great moment for him going out to the toss in that game at Lord's. And we hope decent weather and a good contest.
Absolutely. I think that's a fantastic way to think about it. I mean, I think from South Africa's perspective, look, they've got nothing to lose except, they got to go with the hope that they can try and get something out of it. And Australia, of course, are imperious last year as well last time around when they beat India. And Test cricket is synonymous with Australia. Yeah. And I think for South Africa's perspective, that in some ways it takes one good innings. While it's
indeed
11 players, they do one good innings and one good five, then you all of a sudden the game. And even if it's South Africa puts on 320 and gets Australia somehow for 150, 160, then all of a sudden Australia find themselves, having a mountain to climb. I think that's the beauty about Test cricket. Like, if you think about the Perth Test match that England played in Australia, it took one Herculean innings for Yashasvi Jaiswal, of course, well complimented Virat Kohli, and some phenomenal bowling, which Steve Finn described Bumrah as a joke, the way he bowled that.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, you got a very, very comfortable win. So
indeed.
I think that probably segues to your question about the future of Test cricket.
Yeah. Anyway, we'll come on to the future of Test cricket in a minute. But first, some thoughts about, the whole South African thing, the hoodoo, whatever you want to call it. I mean, their record in ICC tournaments has been problematical, would you say?
Problematic, as there's a very, very polite way of describing it. I mean, it's got to be. I mean, it's almost like South Africa is that cricket side that has been avoiding therapy. For a long time, because there's been something really, because it takes something miraculously for this to happen. And I think Bill and you and I were speaking before, I remember the 99 thing, not just the Herschel Gibbs drop catch, but even the Edgbaston one. And I in no other scenario or any other team from there having done so well, got it all. And I think years later, I chose to last year's 92nd years, he got 99 on that single. But he said he'll only be able to rest, when South Africa's won a World Cup. And I think years later, that's why I think the 2006 game, the 434 game, even though it was not a World Cup final,
right? Yeah,
it was long before T20. That reminds you of the beauty of that game, because it was the first time either side has scored 400 or any side has scored 400.
Yep.
I think the beauty about that was not just Herschel Gibbs was the match winner, was scoring 175 of 100 odd deliveries, but even better, he was dropped on 34 by Nathan Bracken.
Right. Yes.
It's one way to exercise those demons, and one way to remind ourselves that it's all little way. Cricket has a little way of karma. And I remember when it's such a South Africa side, you thought they were going to lose because Mackay 18, number 11 comes to the wicket, facing Bradley. No bookie in the world. You could bet your house on Bradley, knocking his stumps over, but he gets a single off, scores a tie, and then Boucher is throwing runs. And I almost remember a newspaper headline almost saying Hansi Curian looked up in the heavens and smiled, only because of the Edgbaston one, you remember his arms folded, and he was something else, right? Both are stories steeped in incredulity, and both have its own moments. Because from the 99, Australia started dominance. the ones that we knew in the era where Adam Gilchrist was a talented cricketer, but not the world class thing that he was. He still playing ODI, Steve Waugh, Ricky Ponting. I mean, he just started this incredible fortress in Australian cricket. And it was forbidden to even think he would be Australia and anything else, let alone let alone the World Cup final. And I think that was a very turning point because up till then, South Africa had its own, Australia obviously were up there, but any side honestly could have beaten Australia almost. But then since then, it just started, I don't want to say decline of South African cricket, but it started the upward mobility of Australian cricket this year.
Yes. I think South Africa's first one-day final, can you remember after readmission in 1992? That also ended rather unfortunately for them, if you recall. I think they got in. Did they get into the semi-final again? Was it the semi-final against England? And then it rained. That's right. And all of a sudden, it was before Duckworth-Lewis, and suddenly South Africa's target rose to being about sort of 45 in 2 overs or something like that.
Yeah, there was 23 runs of one ball.
Yes.
Brian McMillan at the crease. It was a little before my time, and I remember reading that. And I think it was something like 23 runs of 14 or 15.
Yes, it was very doable. It was very doable. And so,
Even in the pre-T20 era, but with likes of Brian McMillan who could hit a ball a mile away, and the likes of Dave Richardson at the crease I know people remember him now.
Absolutely.
From his ICC role. But, it was very able cricketer, and then to get 23-1, and then it was so horrendously done to the point that people were like, all right, you got to get Duckworth-Lewis, which obviously complicated so many other things. But you would think that's why I talk about final, because one would argue that if South Africa crossed over that, yes, of course, it would come against Imran Khan's Pakistan, which, of course, we know the Pakistan went out to win the World Cup, but you would probably think South Africa could have done it. In 1996, I remember, that was the first World Cup I remember as a kid, and South Africa was so impeccable that time. Looking better than Australia, I think I would almost make a South Africa-Sri Lanka final. It should have been the 2 best sides. But I think on a Karachi wicket, against Brian Lara, which was really helped to see us, they rested white line to Alan Donald. You don't rest your white line, And they played Paul Adams. I don't think Paul Adams probably played to the matches after that. And Brian Lara did what Brian Lara did, and on a flat Karachi wicket, which didn't really help the seam spinners that much. And then, whatever happened, it happened. And then, obviously, we the 99 things still remains etched in our heads. Exercise those years. And then we can just go on about the graveyard of South Africa in 2003 when it miscalculated and they won home.
Oh, that's right. Didn't get to the Super Sixes, right? Poor old Sean Pollock got the numbers wrong. That's right.
Yeah, they got the numbers wrong. They needed one more run to this thing. They just thought a double would be enough at that point, and they blocked it instead of taking a single, and something innocuous like that. And which is why it's almost the only South Africa can do this, because no other side can do this. It's almost like if there's a cricketing god, he's not put against South Africa, because no other side could have experienced this. And of course, in 2011, I remember that because we were covering the World Cup in Singapore, the ESPN, and then 2015, both times, losing to New Zealand. Obviously, I think once was in the quarterfinal, once in the semi-final, but it was just a thing that just got into South African heads, and then it just one thing left to another, and then they had a very poor 2019, and then we remember last year against India, like they looked like they were cruising, and one would argue it was the heroics of Jasprit Bumrah doing Jasprit Bumrah, but you would have bet any other side could have just seen it off. But oh well, here we are.
So anyway, at least this time they have got to a final in Test cricket. And now perhaps we can just say just wonder what lots of people have different views about the future of Test cricket. I think one salutary thing in this very cycle, of course, involving South Africa. I don't know what you think about this, but their trip to New Zealand about a year ago, 15 months ago, South Africa played New Zealand a lot over the years, even in the apartheid era. They'd never lost to New Zealand. This time, they sent a second string, third string side to New Zealand and duly lost because, of course, their understandable concern with the SA20 tournament and with all their best players basically being contracted to play in that T20 tournament. So is this a salutary warning for the future of Test cricket, or is it just a one-off thing and, everything would go back to normal?
I would say I'll answer that in two ways. I remember when the irony is I'm a test strategist, right? I couldn't go tell you much about this year IPL because even though the irony is I started off my first sports journalism stint was covering the first ever IPL when it launched, right? And it was all very new at that time. People did not know what it would become. And I remember talking to Pami Mbawanga, another great African bowler from Zimbabwe, and I said, Pami, what do you make of this? And Pami's like, it'll never ever certain test cricket. Well, test cricket's erratic and it's the Bible, it's the quantum, everything. All that. But if you think about what's happening, right? I remember this series when India lost this, and people blame it on a lot of reasons, right? Against Australia, they're like, oh, there was no one to compliment Bumrah. All that's true. But for me, the reason why India won the 2018 series, and I see that over the 2021, because 2021 was a freakish sense of beauty in its own thing, but it was not, there was no method in the madness. So it just, it was just something that no one could predict or predicted. But 2018, India won for a few reasons. One, of course, there was no Smith and Warner, and because the Indian bowlers bowled well. But there was something else. It was almost like ashes to ashes, dust to dust. If Virat Kohli doesn't get you Pujara, Cheteshwar Pujara scored. He was what I would call the defensive midfielder in football to an attacking midfielder of Virat Kohli. He took the venom out of the Australian attack.
Right.
And to the point allowed Virat Kohli to be Virat Kohli. And if you think about the partnerships he had with Rishabh Pant, both in 2018 and 2021, especially on the Gamba final day, he absorbed the volley blows, literally. And Rishabh Pant, they complement each other well. Pant went up the bowling, he absorbed, he stood at the crease. To the point that one journalist recalled that when he passed by an Australian team meeting and a photo of Pujara came up when they were doing the analysis, Josh Hazelwood picked up a bottle and threw it saying, this guy just frustrates me. He bats in the crease. So where I'm coming with this, Pujara today to someone born in 2000, who's probably 25 today, or even born, you start watching cricket in 2008, 2009, 2010 perhaps, is a curiosity. Because Pujara learning this trade playing traditional test cricket. The problem is today, the young cricketer to break in, you have to break through T20 and come in, well, they'll place the test. We want to be just in Newton and then seamlessly, but he's a bowler. But that technique of test cricket there's no beauty. And you and I are test strategic, Bill, and you've seen the classics of test match cricket. There is beauty in batting the same test match. I can watch Ashwin and Vihari on the final day and Sydney over and over again.
Right.
And the scorecard will never tell you the story because they'll be like, oh, it's just a draw. Every ball was drama. Everything was a drama. I always say Ashwin had a pain in his back and a pain behind his back because, was sledging all along. Yeah. But the way they hit with a back pain and hamstrings and saved the test match, there is beauty in that. That's only chess scholars here that probably understand it. There is a method in madness of a pawn moving or E5 or something, whereas no one understands that the same way today. And I feel that the generation today may not get it. So perhaps this is where the ersatz model is coming out of cricket a little bit. That you're trying to find the ways to make test cricket attractive by creating a World Test Championship. I don't mind it too much because it gives me another 5 years of test cricket. But the test cricket never meant to be a league, right? That if it was a league, it would be on 1 day. It's meant to be all 5 days. It's meant to longevity. It's like if you make one mistake in life, you have a first innings, you have a second innings to do well. If you make one mistake in all of this, you have another second and third test. And it allows all these competition. It tests endurance, stamina, technique, styling. And I always say one of my favorite innings in the modern day era is Ben Stokes and Eddie because they both have the technique of test and the temerity of T20.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
To be able to win that.
Yes.
And I think test cricket is aligned with those kind of things. But we would see there's innovation in test cricket, but will it always sustain itself? Because we've seen our players opt to play for the IPL over test cricket because, again, it becomes a chicken and egg situation, right? The broadcasters are like, well, we won't cover it if there's no audience. And then audience are like, well, the broadcaster won't cover it, how do you watch it? So if the money and the sponsorship all go there, and I think the hardest truth when I was a sports journalist, I realized with everything in the business, the days of the poet and the artist of appreciating art and poetry for the sake of it is So,
well,
the ICC has to put coffers. And the reason why the BCCI is where they are and the hubris of where they are is because, it's asymmetry of power. It's asymmetry of who owns the coffers and the keys. Yeah. So, Jerry Kimber made the documentary, Death of Example.
Yes.
So, we're talking about it. Yeah.
I think one thing that's a bit worrying, I think, for Test cricket is, it may seem odd to say this, but I think the retirement of Virat Kohli. Because I think Virat Kohli was a real enthusiast, passionate about Test cricket. And I'm wondering if there are that many current players in India who feel quite the same way about Test cricket as he did. Or is they, or Shubman Gill? Do you think Shubman Gill will be a good custodian of Test cricket?
Shubman Gill, when he came up, like he was playing with Prithvi Shaw in the Under-19 World Cup that India won. And everyone spoke of Prithvi Shaw at length because Prithvi Shaw is from Bombay and he broke Sachin's school records. And when you're from Bombay, it's like being from Surrey or New South Wales, and it gives you the attention, right? And Shubman Gill was a little more quieter. He was playing in Punjab and stuff like that. And Simon Dewitt also Manara, I've seen the rivalry that Shubman Gill, not Prithvi Shaw. And I remember the Dabba innings. I think I'm at the 21. Shubman Gill's 90 that set it up beautifully for punts, punt, and all of that. But I would say this. Shubman Gill in the last series was so disappointing because to be a world-class cricketer, the 20s and 30s doesn't count. You got to get 100s and big 100s. And Shubman Gill had the golden chance to do that, and he just didn't come through with that. But he is a cricketer who's got technique. One finds follow. We can think about it, and he can come through with the goods. But you're right, Virat Kohli did embody that passion. But the difference is Virat Kohli is from Pujara's age. He remembers the generation before T20. In fact, when Virat Kohli was just won the Under-19 World Cup in 2008 in Malaysia, India just about won the T20 World Cup, and the IPL was just about starting. So Virat Kohli learned his trade probably playing a good forward defensive block. Right, which is why one would say Virat Kohli's power drivers, my goodness me, he's not a therapist, but that is therapy, and he learned it in a classic way. But today, Greg Blewett once said, he was teaching his son how the forward defensive block, and Greg Blewett said, I'm like, no, Dad, teaching me the ramp shot. Because he saw Sam Constance play against Jasprit Bumrah.
Right.
No coach would teach you that, right?
Yeah.
And I think that also explains ties back into Virat Kohli, where Virat Kohli showed above Sam Constance, because Virat Kohli, two things. One is like, how dare you treat the world's best player with such importance? And two is, the position of brash, arrogant 19-year-old was already taken by Lee. You can't give that anymore. So, that, comes to the point of like where it goes to Test cricket. The next generation perhaps may find beauty, perhaps Test cricket will find another way to innovate itself, maybe the World Test Championship. But it's we've kind of written Test cricket off in many ways, and it's kind of come back, it's kind of stayed. But it may come to a point where we'll have to rethink of how to keep it going.
Yeah. I think, I would agree with a lot of that. I think there are a few things. One is, of course, there is more Test cricket played in the last 30 or 40 years than ever before. In the old days, Test cricket was relatively rare, partly because there were so few countries playing it. Now, we've had Test series between Afghanistan and Zimbabwe, etc., which is great. So we can't really start moaning about the demise of Test cricket when there is actually so much of it. But I do have a concern about what you might call the big three are fine. They could go on playing each other very happily for years, and there'd be huge crowds watching it. But I'm worried about countries like, say, South Africa to some point, but say Sri Lanka. What's interesting about Sri Lanka, they started playing Test cricket in 1981. Do you know, you were talking about the cycle of Test cricket, the 5 days over, hopefully, the best thing is, of course, a 5-match series. Do you know Sri Lanka have never played a 5-match series? They've never played a Test series involving more than 3 games. But who is the leading Test wicket taker in history? Muttiah Muralitharan.
Only about to get 800.
Well, the leading left-arm bowler in Test cricket, in Test history, is Rangana Herat. I mean, Kumar Sangakkara is the leading left-handed batter in Test history. I mean, it's very extraordinary what they've achieved. But in the new cycle, the cycle of the World Test Championship, which starts after this final and lasts for 2 years, Sri Lanka played 10 Test matches. That's just not enough. And maybe they prefer it, though. Maybe they'd rather play T20 and all the rest of it. But the fact is, Sri Lanka are not going to produce great Test cricketers. They're playing so little Test cricket.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more with that. I think we talk about instances that changed cricket. 1996 World Cup changed cricket. That was the first World Cup I came into it. And with a young Murali Tharan and a stoic Arjuna Ranatunga, swashbuckling Sanjay Jayasuriya.
Yes, absolutely.
With Arvind De Silva. I mean, it was, and obviously the able agile Chaminda Vas. And that also, at a time when Australian West Indies didn't tour Sri Lanka because of the situation. India sort of a big brother Sri Lanka, and then infamous Eden Gardens thing, which was a very shameful scene, really. And I remember that like nothing. Because my dad, like you, Bill, as you met, is a cricket tragic, from the West Indies eras of, loving what the global south can do against the global north. And I was obviously rooting for Australia in the final, thinking, because Sri Lanka beat India, and that I was more of an Indian partisan fan. And my dad said, "This is actually beautiful. You won't realize it when Sri Lanka wins. Why it's beautiful for cricket." And years later, you see what that meant for a small, tiny island nation in the Indian Ocean against an Australian powerhouse. And, Sri Lanka is probably the size of Tasmania, maybe, to win that. It was phenomenal. It was such a world-class game, which will still give shivers down. I mean, you take a Sanjay Jayasuriya, Murli Tharan, Arvind De Silva at their prime in any team today. And I think, so you're right, because I did not like what was happening right now when I heard about the big three doing this, because this is very redolent of what apartheid South Africa had done, right? Saying that we'd only play certain countries, Australia, England, New Zealand, for obvious reasons. And it's that time when, if people want to understand why the BCI is where they are, there are a couple of reasons. There's a very profound line you learn about geopolitics and about countries where you say, hurt people, hurt people. India still was a country that had post-colonial trauma. And there's a very good scene in 1983, the movie, that captures it, where the Indian team were not given, I think, particular ticket passes for the finals because they assumed that you're never going to get there.
Right.
And the manager comes and tells Kapil Dev, we got independence in 47, but we still have to earn their respect. He's like, well, we mark the calendar down when we get that respect. And I think that's what it was. And then Raghunath Dalia told apartheid South Africa and all the MCC, and ACB then, saying, hang on a minute, you want to recheck your coffin and see where the money comes from? But how do you play amongst ourselves? It's probably the one time in India we were happy to play against Pakistan, the English was spectacular. And that's sort of what reshaped the global dynamics of where cricket is today. And because you remember a time old enough when Dennis Lilly, he never came to India. Because Bradman never toured India. But can you imagine a Pat Cummins not coming to India? No, it's cricketing suicide to not come to India.
Indeed.
Right? And I think that's the whole horizon of where the power landscape has shaped. And I think India doing this is ironically going back to the age of hubris that the age-old MCC and all the other people had. Because that's what cricket's about. It's about putting Imran Khan and Wasim Akram to Pakistan, the Murli Tharan and the Rangana Herats from Sri Lanka, the Flower Brothers, if at all Zimbabwe gets back. And we will be all night long to talk to the West Indies legends, So, it's unfortunate because sports have struggled. The only country that's really been able to come from minnows to somewhat respectable test status and be there has been Bangladesh. Zimbabwe has fallen, Kenya never really rose, and New Zealand, UAE, and all the other teams only are enough to make the numbers in all these World Cups. But it's been a fall for so many countries. Even Pakistan has been a fall on Sri Lanka as well. But it's sad. And it's also, I would argue, a lot of other scenarios that affect these countries. Also, it's the institutions, right? It's a great economics novel called Why Nations Fail, which explains its institutions that build a thing. Right. If you're Lionel Messi's high school counselor, New York may do better than Barcelona as a city. But you won't tell him to go to New York to ply his trade. You tell him to go to Barcelona because that's where La Masia and that's where Barcelona is, and that's where he'll get fame. It's where the institutions are.
Right.
And I think that's sort of what's happened right now. And I think it's not good for the sport. Isolation is never good for the sport. You have to go high. You can't shake it.
No, agreed. Well, Akshob, I think that is an appropriate place maybe to call a halt to this particular podcast, but perhaps we'll have future conversations. But thank you so much. It's been absolutely fascinating, really whetting everybody's appetite, I hope, for this interesting game coming up on Wednesday, the World Test Championship Final. Thank you very much.
Bill, thank you so much. And in true gentlemanly fashion, you knocked the veils off and you called morning tea on the start.
Indeed. Thanks very much.
Enjoy the rest of your Monday. Thank
Absolutely.
you.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that. Please subscribe, and you can do that by looking at the website where you found this. Recommend to your friends, and I'm more than happy to take requests. Thank you.